gentle accent, very gentle, but then don't. No.
What are we putting?
So, right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start it from, because it's 25 minutes long. We're going to start it from page 13. Yes. Exactly, page 13. So we're starting one measure before that, right, Dennis?
109.
Perfect. Okay. Got it.
What's your tempo?
Whenever you're ready, you just start it off. Okay.
Excuse me?
Maybe we
can do it.
I need it. Okay, so yeah. Are you ready? It's rum, ta-da-da-da-da, rum. Yes.
Thank you. Please join me in a few moments of centering silence. And now, please remain seated for our in-gathering hymn, which is number 132. The words also appear in your order of service. Good morning. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Madison. This is a community where curious seekers gather to explore spiritual, ethical, and social issues in an accepting and nurturing environment. Unitarian Universalism supports the freedom of conscience of each individual as together we seek to be a force for good in the world. My name is Karen Rose Gredler, and on behalf of the congregation, I would like to extend a special welcome to any visitors who are with us this morning. We are a welcoming congregation, so whomever you are and wherever you are on your own life's journey, we welcome your presence among us. Visitors are encouraged to stay for our fellowship hour after the service and to look for people holding teal-colored stoneware mugs. These are FUS members knowledgeable about our programs and community life, and they look forward to the chance of speaking with you this morning. You may also stop by our information table outside the library where you can find more information about upcoming events and programs. In this lively acoustical environment, it can sometimes be difficult to hear what's happening in the service. So we remind you that our child haven in that corner and the commons behind the auditorium are excellent places to go when anyone needs to talk or move around. The services can still be seen and heard well from those areas. We also have hearing devices available, so please see one of the ushers if you think that would be helpful to you. This would also be an excellent time to turn off any electronic devices that might disrupt the service, such as cell phone ringers. Experienced guides are generally available to give building tours after each service. So if you would like to learn more about this sustainably designed addition or our National Landmark Meeting House, please meet near the large glass window. That would be the thing that all the glaring sun's coming through right now, right after the service there at the left. Now I'd like to acknowledge those individuals who help our services run smoothly. At this service, we have David Briles handling sound. We have Lois Evenson as our lay minister. Greeters were Claire Box and Pam McMillan. Our ushers are Liza Monroe, Dick Goldberg, Chuck Evenson, and I believe there's one more person, Rick DeVita filled in, so we'd have a full complement. Our lovely flowers are in honor of beloved members who've recently passed, Nancy and Bob Dott. Aren't they pretty? Our tour guide will be John Powell, and he will be here later, as I mentioned, for anyone who wants to meet to get a tour. Also, please see the announcements in the red floors insert in our order of service. Held up the wrong thing. where there is lots of information about things that are going on today and particularly in the near future. So please take a look at all of that. And you will also see folks working on our new pledge drive, and we'll have some comments about that as well. Are you going to come up now to do that? Okay. Now for the pledge comment or later? Okay, never mind. I don't know what I'm doing. Again, welcome. We hope today's service will stimulate your mind, touch your heart, and stir your spirit. Thank you.
In this quiet hour, may our spirits be renewed. And in this gathering of kindred spirits, we be ready to extend ourselves to those in need and, with trust, receive the hand that is offered to us. In this community of high ideals, may we remember the principles that guide us and reflect upon those things that give greater meaning to our lives, renewing our dedication to serve the highest that we know. In this time of worship, may our minds be open to new insights. May our hearts be moved to greater compassion. May we give thanks for the lives that we are blessed to share. I invite you to rise in body or in spirit for the lighting of our chalice, and Ann Smiley will assist to this process. And if you will join me in reading the words of affirmation printed in this morning's program. I believe that unarmed truth and conditional love will have the final word in reality. I have the audacity to believe that peoples everywhere can have 3 meals a day for their bodies, education and culture for their minds, and dignity, equality, and freedom for their spirits. I believe that what self-centered people have torn down, other-centered people can build up. And in the spirit of that other-centeredness, please turn to your neighbor and extend to them a warm greeting. Whoops. Please be seated. And I'd like to invite our children now to come forward for the message for all ages. You won. Well, welcome everybody. So I see you've got a really neat hat. Is that your only hat? If you got more hats than one? You think you got more than one? Yeah. How many of you have toys at home? Everybody got toys? Have you got lots of toys? Have you got too many toys? Do you have too many toys at home? How do you know when you have How do you know when you have too many toys? Yeah, you can't fit them into your house. Well, this is a story. This is a story that has to do with this very problem. Okay. This is a story about Simon the Fiddler. Now, Simon the Fiddler had a cozy little house, and he had everything that he needed. He had a chair to sit in. He had a bed to sleep in. You all got beds, right? He had food to eat. He had clothes to wear. He had a nice soft hat, kind of like your hat. He had a toy animal. He had good friends, and most of all, he had a beautiful fiddle whose voice was as sweet as honey. A fiddle and a violin are kind of the same thing, right? And so for a long time living in his house, Simon was perfectly happy, and he took care of his house. And he spent time with his friends, and he played his fiddle to his heart's content. He was very happy. But then one day, Simon looked around that little house of his and he thought to himself, I don't have enough. I want more. So Simon got himself another chair. And another. And another. And a few more. And soon Simon had many, many chairs. But Simon still thought, I don't have enough. So he got another hat. And another. and another, and then a few more. And soon Simon had many, many hats. And still, Simon thought, I don't have enough. So he got another toy animal, and another, and then a few more, and soon Simon had many, many toy animals, and for a while he really enjoyed having more. Until Simon noticed that his house was getting kind of crowded, and in fact it got so crowded that he could hardly move around. And at this point, Simon missed his simple life. And he missed just taking care of a simple house and spending more time with his friends and playing with his beautiful fiddle. And he cried out, I have too much. So what do you think he would have done? Yeah, that's right. He called, I got junk. And they came and... No, he didn't do that. He did something like the Northwest Indians do. He held a kind of a potlatch. He set up a long table, and he put all the chairs that he'd gotten around the table, and he put a hat and a toy animal next to each one of those chairs on the table. And then he decorated his small house, and he baked a big cake. And when everything was ready, he invited all of his friends to come over for a wonderful party. And when Simon's friends arrived, they said, hello, it's been so long. And they all sat down on the chairs, and they put on the hats, and they played with all the toy animals. And it was a wonderful party. Everyone talked, and they sang, and they danced, and they ate cake until there were only crumbs left. They danced on the table, believe it or not. And when the party was over, Simon's friends began to take off their party hats and put down their animals. And Simon said, no, don't do that. Keep the hats on your head. Keep the toy animals in your arms. Take them all home with you. I don't want to have more anymore. Thank you, everyone said. Oh, what a wonderful party, the best party we've ever seen. And Simon thought so too. And after they'd left, he breathed a sigh of relief. He had just enough, but not too much. And he was perfectly happy again. Not too little, not too much, just enough. So kind of think about that. How much is enough? How much do you need actually to make you happy? And when does having too much become kind of bothersome? You got to take care of all that stuff, don't you? Okay? So kind of think about that and maybe have a little conversation with your parents about it sometime. Yeah. Yeah, lots of stuff. Well, when you get to be my age, you start thinking about doing exactly what Simon did, So, all right, well, thank you all for listening, and we're going to sing you out with hymn number 315. seated. Now it is our pleasure to welcome once again this year 2 participants in the UW-Madison Odyssey Project, and they are sharing 2 original readings. And Kina and Shar, please step forward. Thank you very much for being here.
Good morning. My name is Shar, and of course we know our topic is about poverty. Poverty, the access to basic needs. Clean water. The water that flows from my faucet is contaminated. The lakes, the oceans. Do people and animals really matter? Shelter. Look around. The schools, the churches, and yes, even Madison. The Odyssey program has women, men, and children that need housing, high rent, temporary shelters, unjust application procedures. Our administration, just empty chatter, chatter, chatter. Food, processed and non-nutritious, dollar store budget. I make too much money. The state has cut me off food stamps, and my kids are crying and hungry. Did I ask for this cold, dark, cruel, and new poverty in America? No, no, no. I will teach my kids that you can change and teach a world that sees you as a victim of poverty, because we walk with dignity and love and clarity.
Good morning. My name is Kina, and I will read to you a piece I wrote called Rich, Poor Woman. Rich is better than poor until the cost to be rich is paid in intoxicated blows to my teenage body. Kicks and fists delivered by the father of my child, soaked in alcoholic rage. Pleas and screams for help absorbed and unanswered. Hopeless tears landing on eggshells that I didn't tiptoe on gently enough. Leave? I can't leave. That's impossible. No longer was I his girlfriend. I'd become his property. Leaving was never an option. I never imagined a life outside of stable and unpredictable abuse. As a little girl, we snuck out in the middle of the night, leaving everything, including the state we lived in, just to escape my abusive father. And there I was, just years later, in the same cycle with my own child this time. Rich is better than poor when starting over is a myth. If I leave him, he will find me and kill me. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to go. Being rich seemed better when I was poor in my esteem, poor in my self-worth, poor in my understanding of love. When I finally left him, I had nothing. No money, no plan, and eventually, no home. Just me and my toddler, starting over with nothing but freedom. I was poor, but for the first time, I felt rich. Dinner at the soup kitchen, showers at a gym, writing again, exploring hobbies, laughing, exploring talents, no guilt, no fear. None of that cost me a dime, and as a poor woman, free was within my budget. Having say-so over my body every day. Poor in my pockets, rich in my joy. Don't pity me. because I am now happy and free. Either I was brave enough to leave, or I had nothing else to lose. Facing the unknown and starting over from scratch, growing in my confidence, creativity, and boldness. Every time the sun rises on my skin, and every time I go to sleep without worrying about that drunken boogeyman stumbling through my front door, I know that I made the right choice to start over and be poor. Everything in life comes with consequence, sacrifice, side effect, and a cost. Breaking the cycle of abuse was my choice. Poor isn't my name, and it doesn't define me. Poor happens to be a side effect of generations of domestic abuse, untreated mental health issues turned into substance abuse, my single mother doing the best she could to raise her daughters alone with few resources, not being able to teach us something that she didn't know herself, and me not being able to fix something that I didn't even know was wrong. Rich is better than poor, but poor is just one of the side effects of a bigger, deeper issue that started generations ago. I'm just working relentlessly to break free from the cycles. In this journey of growth, knowledge, and purpose, I have become a rich, poor woman, knowing no limits. I am a rich, poor woman, breaking cycles and chains. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us again, my friends. It's wonderful to have you back. The story of Siddhartha Gautama's sacrifice of a privileged princely life for a life of physical austerity. That's a familiar story. Confronted with the spectacle of poverty and illness and aging and death, Siddhartha set out to discover the underlying source of human suffering and how that suffering might be remedied. And Siddhartha, like many others before and after him, was initially convinced that only by literally killing off all the human passions, denying oneself every aspect of physical comfort and pleasure, only by this means could a person achieve perfect peace and equanimity and permanent release from life's travails. And so rigorous did his ascetic practices become that it very nearly cost Siddhartha his life. Discovering him severely malnourished and in a semi-stupor, a passerby revived Siddhartha by offering him small portions of milk, and gradually he regained sufficient strength to continue on his spiritual journey. And it was not long after that revival that Siddhartha achieved enlightenment and became the Buddha, he who is awake. And at this point, he eschews the aesthetic path, and he now advocates a more moderate approach to spiritual seeking that he called the middle way, or as Simon the Fiddler put it, just enough and not too much. The 19th century transcendentalist Henry David Thoreau was of much the same mind. He advocated what he called voluntary poverty. And Thoreau argued that if one had secured the basics in terms of food and shelter and clothing and fuel, at that point one would be in a position, like the Buddha, to, quote, entertain the true problems of life with freedom and the prospect of success. And besides bestowing individual benefits, Thoreau claimed that voluntary poverty could also be a boon to society. I am convinced, he wrote, that if all men were to live simply, that thievery and robbery would be unknown. These take place only in communities where some have got more than is sufficient, while others have not enough. But if Henry David Thoreau and the Buddha could be described as moderates in this regard, others have moved and taken on a more extreme position. They have been moved to great material sacrifices. So like Siddhartha, St. Francis of Assisi was born into wealth and privilege from a very rich merchant family. And indeed, the very prospect of poverty and disease frightened Francis so much that he would go out of his way when he was traveling around Italy on business to avoid coming into any contact with members of medieval society's underclass. But then legend has it that Francis received this revelation. Francis, this disembodied voice told him, Francis, everything that you have loved, everything you have desired in the flesh, it is now your duty to despise and to hate. Now the voice, which he took to be God's, went on to reassure Francis that he would come to abhor the comforts that he had always experienced and that he would find delight among the ranks of the poor, and he should make the cause of the poor his own cause. And so thus encouraged, Francis took that leap of faith, he renounced his wealth and his status, and he founded an order committed to serving the poor. And paradoxically, he did experience a freedom from fear and a joy that he had never previously known. Now, when he died at the hands of an assassin some 70 years ago, Mohandas K. Gandhi's personal possessions consisted of a pair of eyeglasses, sandals, a spinning wheel, pocket watch, rice bowl, and a walking stick. Sometimes described as the ultimate minimalist, Gandhi steadily reduced his food requirements until he was able to consume, as he put it, the most non-violent vegetarian meal that the very poorest human being could afford. Now, like Francis, Gandhi's choice of clothing, typically nothing more than a dhoti or loincloth, was also dictated by his desire to live in a state of holy poverty. And for him, the loincloth or the dhoti symbolized solidarity with the poor. And he said, as long as India's poor are kept naked because of British imperialism, Gandhi said, I will wear nothing more than the poorest person can afford, even if I were to come into the presence of the King of England. Both Gandhi and Francis were God-possessed, and both felt called by a higher power to embrace a life of poverty. I know that God is found more often in the lowliest of his creatures than in the high and mighty, Gandhi explained. And I am struggling to reach the status of these, the lowest of the low, and hence my passion for service to the suppressed classes. Now, what's noteworthy about these several examples of holy poverty is that each one of them features, to a greater or lesser degree, a social as well as a personal spiritual dimension. Thoreau's concerns about the growing economic equality in the 1840s and how that affected human relationships, those concerns that he expressed 175 years ago are still all too relevant today, aren't they? And if people could just recognize, he believed, that less is more, and if they would be willing to work for a fairer distribution of wealth, we'd all be so much better off. Francis and Gandhi chose to be poor, ostensibly for religious reasons, but this is not to say that they sanctioned poverty for everyone. Both of them deplored the plight of the dispossessed, and they sought to use their stature as holy figures to combat the stigma of poverty and to underscore our common humanity. And so both of these men initiated movements that were meant to improve the lives of our poorest citizens. Now, for his part, the Buddha was convinced from his own experience that want and hunger are an impediment to spiritual advancement. And contemporary research does, in fact, bear him out. Some years ago, researchers at the University of Minnesota recruited a number of healthy volunteers who would be willing to reduce their caloric intake to just slightly above the starvation level. The subjects later described the experience as horrific. And not so much because, they said, because of the physical discomfort, but because over time, food became the only thing that they cared about. Scarcity, as Cass Sunstein summarized the results, scarcity captures the mind. This is especially true for children. We may sometimes wonder why academic success often eludes kids from impoverished families. Well, there's lack of stable housing, overwhelmed parents, that's part of the reason, but so is hunger. Hunger makes a child feel cold all the time, Ursula Le Guin recently wrote. It makes a child stupid, she said. It makes a child sick. And Le Guin goes on to note that one school-age child in 3 in this country cannot count on 3 meals per day. 1 in 3. Despite the incredible wealth at our disposal, wealth far in excess of anything that Francis or Gandhi could have imagined, despite our wealth, there is so little sympathy for the least of those among us. The absence of an ongoing active effort to improve the lot of our poorest citizens. These days, it's hard to imagine any sane politician mounting a war on poverty, as Lyndon Johnson did in 1964, when the national poverty rate was about the same as it is today. This is what I call unholy poverty. It is unchosen, and it is often inadvertent. And yet there is this widespread feeling among Americans, and even among many poor people themselves, that if you are disadvantaged in this way, you have only yourself to blame. 60% of Americans surveyed in 2014 described the poor as lazy, an attitude that was shared by only 24% of Europeans. And perhaps even more surprising, given Jesus' oft-expressed concern for the plight of the poor, even more surprising to me at least, is that 46% of all American Christians and 53% of white evangelical Christians fault the poor for their lack of effort. Other critics have argued that the poor act irresponsibly with their resources, and thus Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley attributed the failure of low-income individuals to climb the economic ladder to their, as he put it, habit of spending all their money on booze, women, and movies. Now, although it does exist, reckless spending is hardly the rule among those mired in poverty. More often, low-income Americans must make some very hard choices, whether to pay the rent, the utility company, or perhaps spring for a sack of nutritious vegetables. Some 58 million American workers earn less than $15 an hour. 42 million American workers earn less than the poverty wage of $12 an hour. 12 million working Americans are dependent on payday lenders and the exorbitant interest payments that they charge just to meet daily necessities. Exploitation thrives when it comes to the essentials. Matthew Desmond writes in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Evicted. More often than not, these payday loans are used to pay for life's necessities, not for its little luxuries. Now, those who hold poor people responsible for their status often point to these individuals who overcame those formidable obstacles and ascended into the ranks of the middle class. It's all about willpower. It's about perseverance and resourcefulness and making the most of your God-given talents, they would argue. And there is, in fact, no denying that a limited number of impressive women and men do make good. And of course, this does lend a certain credence to that hoary Horatio Alger story, the story of the self-made man or woman. But we have to remember that Horatio Alger was the product of 19th century fiction. He was a character invented, in fact, by a former Unitarian minister. And yet, individual advancement is, in fact, possible here in the U.S. Shar and Keena had demonstrated that for us earlier in our service today. But when it comes to overall social mobility, we rank near the bottom compared to other so-called wealthy societies. As Jeff Madrick recently observed, the more privileged parents are, the more likely their children will be upwardly mobile. The rest are left behind. And that gap, he says, is steadily widening. There are reasons why it has become increasingly difficult for impoverished Americans to improve upon their situation. These days, the truly destitute face what the social historian Earl Shorrock describes as a surround of force. A surround of force. And this was described again by Keena and Shar in their readings that you heard a bit earlier. Shorrock says, their environment contains so many inhibiting forces: hunger, isolation, exploitative landlords, police, drugs, illness, racism, that poor people literally cannot find an exit, and in many cases, they have ceased believing that any such exits actually do exist. The Milwaukee families that Matthew Desmond followed over a course of time in his study of eviction, they are a case in point. Because when a party loses their home because they can't afford the rent payments which oftentimes will absorb 50, 60, 75% of their weekly take-home pay, then this creates a whole cascade of other problems. Furniture, clothing, books can all be lost in the process of eviction. Support networks are sundered, schooling is disrupted, and having once been evicted, the tenant will now be considered a poor risk by other landlords, and their applications will be rejected. And so the affected individual may have no other option than to move into substandard housing in a dangerous neighborhood, which, as Matthew Desmond says, is a blow to one's psychological health, and it engenders fatigue and a sense of hopelessness. Now, these conditions affect poor whites in decaying rural communities as well as poor people of color in our inner cities. Surveys indicate that members of that cohort, the white poor, are losing confidence in their ability to create the conditions for their own success. They represent 2/3 of America's poor, and they are now the most pessimistic of all racial and ethnic groups. In the end, poverty not only captures the mind, it kills the human spirit. Now, what makes today's poverty unholy is not just the mental and physical suffering, not just the reduced lifespans that it produces, but the realization that those who have the power to create a more equitable culture, those people just don't care. It's almost as if most of our leaders at the state and the federal level have been channeling Ayn Rand, who put it this way in an article entitled Man's Rights. There are no economic rights, she said. There are no collective rights. There are no public interest rights. The right to life means that a man has the right to support his life by his own work. And it does not mean that others must provide him with the necessities of life. Every man and woman for him or herself. The U.S. social safety net is now the weakest among the world's wealthy nations. And according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, our country's overall poverty prevention rating is significantly lower, not just than Germany's, not just than Norway's and Sweden's and Denmark's. It is lower than Poland's and Portugal's and South Korea's and Turkey's. Jeff Madrick says that no moral code, no ethical principle, no piece of scripture, no holy teaching can be summoned to defend what we have allowed this country to become. So perhaps what we need is another Great Depression to turn things around. Back in the 1930s, as more and more jobs were lost, sympathy for the poor began to increase. And support grew in this country for Social Security, the Works Progress Administration, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And that survival of the fittest, social Darwinism that had informed social policy during the Gilded Age, that fell out of favor. And then building on those New Deal initiatives after World War II, the government passed a generously funded GI Bill that enabled millions of returning service personnel to attend college, to become homeowners, to be covered by unemployment insurance. And by these collective means, a whole generation of, yes, white Americans were able to achieve middle-class status. People of color were left out, of course. What's truly disappointing about this is that the many who benefited from this grand social experiment in redistribution, that these people, for the most part, have no interest in extending similar consideration to those who are now struggling today. Millions of Americans face eviction every year for lack of resources. And in many communities, the waiting period for public housing can be counted in decades. Only one family in 3 gets any kind of rent support assistance in this country today. As Dr. King observed without irony some 50 years ago, so often in America we have socialism for the rich and rugged free enterprise capitalism for the poor. Society's resources are allocated, as we well know, not on the basis of need, but in proportion to a particular group's political clout. And as a result of this, 20% of the U.S. population now has a negative net worth. They owe more than they own. More and more jobs, as we know, are part-time, temporary, contract labor, which means that they do not include benefits or sick leave or vacation or retirement plans. And thanks to the tireless efforts of the business class and its political allies, the strength of organized labor continues to slide. Today, fewer than 11% of Americans are covered by a union contract, and that is probably going to get worse with the next Supreme Court ruling on public sector unions. And as of yet, no mass movement of low-wage earners and the poor has arisen to challenge this unjust system. No movement has arisen since 1967, when Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy mounted the Poor People's Campaign that then faltered after King's assassination. Writing in the New York Review of Books recently, Nicholas Kristof mused about the seeming passivity of so many of today's poor people. He said, they are far too willing to acquiesce because they have been conditioned to retreat to the margins. And so I have found myself thinking, Kristof says, that the problem is not that the poor riot too much, it's that they don't riot enough. As a disciple of Gandhi, Martin Luther King would have questioned Nicholas Kristof's solution, but he would not have questioned his intent. And thankfully now, 50 years later, the Reverend William Barber is calling for a new initiative patterned on King's earlier efforts to build a multiracial coalition to eradicate unholy poverty in this country. It is a movement that we as Unitarian Universalists are called upon to support. So let us then embrace the maladjustment that Dr. King once spoke of. He said, "I never intend to adjust myself to the inequalities of an economic system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. The salvation of the world lies in the hands of the maladjusted." As a postscript, today we celebrate the existence of the Odyssey Project and other projects like it that do provide underprivileged individuals with the opportunity to earn college-level credits with the prospect of entering into and completing a 2- or 4-year degree program. And this is one of the best avenues available for those seeking a rewarding career and an economically secure life. First Unitarian Society is proud to have partnered with the Odyssey Project in this endeavor for many years and as it has steadily expanded its efforts. And yet this is just one of many ways in which our faith community has sought to mitigate the effects of poverty, whether through our eviction prevention program, supporting sensible family planning, or working to close Dane County's racial equity gap. Faith in action of the kind we practice can make a difference, and I believe that over time it can help to foster a culture of mutual concern and of sharing. Blessed be, and amen. Larry, would you bring me the book that's right next to you there? We gather each week as a community of memory and of hope, and to this time and place we bring our whole and sometimes our broken selves. We carry with us the joys and sorrows of the recent past, seeking here a place where they might be received and celebrated and shared. We did acknowledge earlier on that these flowers are given in memory of Nancy and Bob Dott. Nancy's memorial service was held here yesterday, and before that service, Nancy Dott's and Bob Dott's ashes were interred together at Forest Hills Cemetery. Bob Dott, as you may or may not know, died 6 weeks after Nancy's passing. His memorial service will be held on April 21st in the Landmark Building at 12:30. We also celebrate the memory today of Greg Erickson, who died of a sudden heart attack, we believe, on Wednesday. And Greg's woodworking skills and his contributions to our buildings are in display and fondly remembered daily. Eric designed and built this pulpit and these 2 tables behind me, and he supervised most of the interior woodwork that was done on this atrium addition. And his memorial service is pending. Best wishes finally and warm healing thoughts to Karen Updike, who suffered an apparent stroke last night, and we wish her a full and complete recovery. In addition to those just mentioned, we would acknowledge any unspoken joys and sorrows that remain among us. As a community of concern and caring, we hold those in our hearts as well. And now I do invite you to participate in the morning's offering.
Hi, I'm Larry Fanland, and I'd like to share with you why I pledged the annual campaign. My husband and I first visited the meeting house about 8 years ago. Good friends had urged us to give it a try, but we were skeptical. Neither of us had especially warm thoughts about the religious organizations we'd grown up with, a path many of you in this room can probably identify with. Still, we felt the need for a spiritual home and a closer community, so we gave it a try. From our first visit, we came away impressed. But we still had our doubts. Would we need to sign on to a rigid set of beliefs? Would FUS be inclusive? Was there a strong commitment to social justice? Could such a large congregation be welcoming to new members? The more we learned, the more we discovered that it was a perfect fit. In the years since, I've benefited each week from thoughtful sermons and beautiful music. Today is a perfect example. I've been proud of our social justice efforts. I've made close friendships. I have a special place in my heart for the wonderful people in my chalice group, the Japanese Crane meditation class. As I've gotten to know First Unitarian better, I've looked for ways to give back. Most of it has been little things that are frankly fun, helping to hide Easter eggs, bringing baked goods to the art fair, singing in one of our amazing choirs. I've been happy to give my time. Another joy has been giving financial support to FUS through the annual campaign. There are so many needs in the world right now. It can be hard to prioritize giving, but I've seen firsthand the thoughtful planning and excellent use that FUS makes of our support. I know the coming year is an important one in the history of our congregation. I'm confident that my pledge to the annual campaign will help keep First Unitarian Society a force for good and a place where the next set of skeptics can find a home. I'd ask you to consider all that FUS means to you and all the ways it helps to make our world more just. I hope you will keep those things in mind as you decide on your own annual pledge.
Larry. And now I'd invite you to rise in body or in spirit once more for our closing hymn, 146. Please be seated for the benediction and the postlude. For that which has been done to lift humankind to new levels of social order and health, let us be thankful. And for that which we can do but have left undone, let us strive to give that new life. And for what needs to be done but is still beyond our reach, let us continue to search and to seek and to nurture our fondest hopes. Blessed be, and amen.